Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Luis Fernandez. 4 years ago, consumer electronics giant Apple promised to create 3,000 jobs and build a hulking new campus in Research Triangle Park. But so far, construction hasn't started, and the company says it needs more time to meet hiring goals tied to hundreds of millions of dollars in state economic incentives. This week, the state agreed to adjust the deadlines to accommodate the company. WRAL state government editor and Daily Download co-host Jack Hagel joins us now to explain what's going on. Jack, good to see you.
Good to be here.
So for those who aren't up on the deal, can you explain what Apple had initially promised?
Sure. Back in 2021, the company said it really wanted to grow out in RTP, the Wake County section of RTP. They planned to build 1 million square feet of offices there. They said it was going to cost about $1 billion, so that's $1 billion in investment coming into the state, into the county. And they were going to create 3,000 high-paying jobs. These jobs were going to pay almost $190,000 a year. That's 3 times the county average, which, Wake County already has high wages. And so to have these kinds of jobs, the state was pretty excited about it.
So what did the state offer in return?
Well, the state offered job grants worth almost $850 million, and that's provided the company meets hiring and investment goals. The state often does this. They draw up these incentives deals to entice companies to come. At the end of the day, they say, if you're going to create jobs that are paying a lot of money and there's going to be new construction that's going to lead to property taxes, payroll taxes, those are things that kind of benefit the community. And so as an enticement, they say, okay, if you do all this stuff and it helps the economy grow, we'll give you some money back as a reward for making good on your promises.
So speaking of those promises, where does the company stand on its promises now?
So these deals are broken down by year. Like I said, the company had said it would create up to 3,000 jobs by 2034. So starting in 2023, that was the first year it was sort of counted. They were to create a certain number of jobs. Anyway, by the end of this year, they were to have created 990 jobs towards that 3,000, at least 990. Now, they had about 1,100 employees when they signed the deal, and they were required to keep those jobs. And so in addition to those jobs, the 990, they should have had more than 2,000 by about this time. But the company currently only has about 1,600 jobs in the Triangle. It's unclear if, they retained those 1,100 jobs and didn't create enough, or if they created the right number of jobs but didn't retain enough. Either way, the company didn't have enough jobs to sort of meet what was drawn out in the agreement. Now, we kind of had an idea that this is kind of where things were headed. In the middle of last year, the company said they were going to pump the brakes on building the new RTP campus. They said they were continuing to grow. They said that they had hired about 600 people at that point. But it was clear that they were kind of rethinking things. And so anyway, on Tuesday, the state agreed to sort of move the deadlines. So I think the first year, again, was 2023 that they were going to be counted, for their hiring to see if they could meet these goals for their incentives. And the state really agreed to push that forward to 2027, so by 4 years. So now they're going to come back and look in 2027 and say, okay, well, how many people have you created? Have you retained those jobs? And if they have, then they can get sort of the first payments of these, $845 million incentives. So it would be sort of the first chunk of that.
Let's go ahead and take a quick break there. When we come back, we'll hear more about the state's decision to give Apple more time and why other companies weren't so lucky. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL State Government Editor Jack Hagel about economic development in North Carolina. Jack, before the break, you mentioned that the state adjusted performance deadlines for Apple to give it more time to meet incentives targets. Is that unusual?
Yes and no. The state can, and sometimes does, make minor adjustments on the front end in particular for agreements, to sort of allow companies a little bit of wiggle room as they ramp up. Maybe, something might happen that causes construction to be a little bit slower than expected. But, they tend to build a little bit of margin in there in case something comes up. But this is perhaps one of the bigger adjustments I've seen. To move the deadline by 4 years is pretty unusual. What's more common is when a company fails to meet those hiring targets or its investment targets. sometimes they'll just say, look, our strategy has changed or the economy has changed, and we just don't see ourselves making those goals. And so maybe we just kind of cut this deal. And oftentimes, I would say more times than not, that happens before any payment is made. And most times that comes at the request of the company, and the state says, okay, well, if you're not going to do that, that's fine. We'll just end the deal. No harm, no foul. And like I said, that doesn't mean that the state will pay it out. They design these in such a way so that they pay on performance, not on the promise. Sometimes companies will have created jobs and then they've gotten some payments, and the state will say, okay, we're going to terminate the deal there. The state, I think, does have some clawback provisions that allows them to take back the money, but oftentimes it lets the company keep that money, in large part because they've created those jobs. And that's usually in situations where they not only have created the jobs, but plan on keeping the jobs there. They're just not going to grow anymore. So, that's sometimes that happens, but that's more common for them to end the agreement than it is for them to really kind of push forward the deadlines by 4 years. Again, we learned, last year that the company was thinking about delaying the construction of its building, which, again, that investment part of it is tied into the incentives. So we had an idea that part of this was going to need some adjustment. But again, it's very unusual to see it extended forward by that much.
So why did they make an exception for Apple?
Well, a few reasons. First of all, Apple's a big company.
Yeah.
It's a successful company. They have a lot of jobs in North Carolina. And the state, ever since the company has said, look, we're going to pump the brakes on the RTP campus, the state has been meeting with the company and sort of going over their plans. And they feel comfortable with the company's promise to continue to grow here. The company says it plans on moving forward with its project here. They said that to the state in a letter this month. And so the state feels comfortable with that. And so they're going to say, let's just reset the clock and see what happens. There's another element to this, too. In September, state lawmakers changed the law to allow the Commerce Department a little bit more flexibility on changing these deadlines. And it's primarily for really big job commitments and what they call transformative projects, the ones that are going to offer thousands of jobs and, upwards of $1 billion in investment. And Apple is one of those companies. There are other companies that may not qualify. For instance, last week, we were talking about companies whose deals could be terminated. That happened with two companies. One is a company called Marshall USA. They fix airplanes, and they had planned to hire hundreds of people out in Greensboro, but contracts didn't come through as expected. They hired only 4 people, and they said, look, we're just going to kind of cut bait on this, so let's just kind of terminate this contract. Thank you. And they didn't get any payments. The other was Corning, which has employees in Edgecombe County and in Durham County, and they had planned a big expansion. But then after COVID, there were some supply chain issues that ultimately led them to sort of adjust what their hiring plans were. And so they ended up not hiring the jobs they created. And so the state canceled that deal too. Those companies didn't qualify, in large part just because those deals weren't as big as what Apple is promising. So it comes down to the state law, but also just kind of the state's due diligence into the company, their comfort level with Apple saying, look, we're going to still do these jobs, just give us a little bit more time. And, the state thinks they're acting in good faith.
So you mentioned the state is comfortable, but what if the company doesn't grow as expected? Apple's this massive, corporation, but at the same time, what if it doesn't work out?
Well, that's a reasonable concern. Lots of tech companies have been laying off people. Microsoft and Amazon have laid off tens of thousands of people in the past few months as they've ramped up investment in things like artificial intelligence. Bloomberg and Reuters had reported recently that even Apple had started laying off some folks, which is unusual for that company. So I think that's a reasonable question. At the same time, though, I think the state is saying, look, the way that this deal is structured, let's just give them a little bit more time. And if they don't do it, we're not going to pay any money out. There's no risk. The only main issue might be, okay, well, what happens with this land if they don't build there? But, there are other places you can build in the triangle if other companies want to come in. If they don't bring these 3,000 jobs in, I think the state feels pretty comfortable that it's not going to be a huge knock on the local economy.
What kind of message does this, delaying, pushing this back, what kind of message does it send to other companies?
You could see that a few ways. If you're a company that is already in some sort of economic development agreement, you hit some sort of snag or your strategy changes and maybe you're not going to hire as many people as you initially expected, and the state doesn't budge for you or can't budge for you under this new law, you might see that as kind of like, hey, that's not fair. On the other hand, if you're a company that's looking to move to the state and you want to be one of these transformative projects that's going to bring thousands of jobs and $1 billion in investment, and if you're on the fence, you might say, hey, wait a minute, this state might be willing to work with me if something comes up. These deals, again, are done over many, many years. So it can be boom and bust markets. Companies get bought. Strategies change. Technology changes. Maybe the way that the company does its business entirely. I mean, look at Apple, how it started as a computer company. Now it's doing all kinds of consumer electronics. So much can happen over the course of these things. And if you're concerned about any possible change, it seems to me that a company might say, look, they're willing to work with me, or they have had a history of working with companies. Maybe we can figure something out. And I could see that giving some companies a little bit of comfort. The way the law was written, though, it appears as though it was written very specifically for certain companies. In this case, it may have only been written for one company, Apple, but there is precedent now, and I wonder if we'll see more deals like this.
You mentioned earlier 2 canceled deals, Marshall USA and Corning, and then we have Apple being put on ice over just the past week. Is this any cause for broader concern?
The triangle has always sort of weathered economic storms. We talked a little bit about how technology companies in particular are laying off people as they increase investments in AI and things like that. But the state has done a pretty good job of manufacturing a wide variety of companies. And remember, the state this year was ranked the best state in which to do business by CNBC. Corporate recruiters really lean on that. And I think they have the receipts to show that their sales pitch is working. In the past year, the state has announced projects that promise to bring more than 30,000 jobs to the state. And thousands of those have been announced just in the past few weeks. So I think they look at what's happened over the past year, over the past few weeks, and I think they look at their pipeline, and I think they're pretty comfortable that if Apple flames out or if some smaller deals fall apart, they think they're pretty well protected by what's already happening in the state and what might come.
We know you'll be watching all of this develop closely, Jack. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's WRAL State Government Editor Jack Hagel. For his coverage of the Apple deal, go to the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. I'm Luis Fernandez. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.